Hello, Psychology of Learning students. So this is the second video talking about Chapter 2, Research Methods. I'm going to share the screen so we can be looking at the PowerPoint slides. So last time we talked about the 4 assumptions, or in the first video we talked about the 4 assumptions that we use when we use the scientific method. And you need to really know and remember that we use these 4 when we're looking at the science of the study of learning. And so all of the information that you'll be taught in this class, it's only true if those 4 assumptions are true. So if you believe some of those assumptions are not accurate, then the information that you're learning will not apply in the situations when those assumptions do not apply. Okay. Then we talked about some of the really common dependent variables that are used when we go to measure learning, when we go to measure change. We talked about errors and latency and rate and topography and I'm going blank on a couple of the others, but you want to make, these are really, really common measures of learning that we use, and you want to be able to very easily recognize each of them, know what they are, and whenever you're asked to create an experiment or to think about how we would answer or study a question, you're probably going to want to rely on one of those 7 measures, since they're sort of our tried and true measures when we're looking at learning. Okay, so now that we've talked or your text has gone over the different types of ways that we measure learning or changes in behavior, now we want to talk about what are the methods that we actually use. And in order to be in this class, Psychology of Learning, I know you've taken general psychology. And in general psychology, you covered some of the basic research methods. We talked about, or in that class, you talked about the survey research method, and archival research, and observational research, and correlational research, and that kind of thing. So I'm going to cover, I'm going to follow the book and just talk about the research methods that are presented in Chapter 2 of your book. And remember that each of these methods will affect how trustworthy or reliable or valid your data is. And so the method that you choose is not just a whimsical thing, oh, it doesn't matter, just pick. Each method is going to have advantages and disadvantages, and you want to pick the method. You can only conclude and interpret the results in terms of the method that you used. So, and you want to pick a method that's going to give you the most reliable, valid data given the boundary conditions that you have. So the first one that your book talks about is anecdotal information. And I'm so glad that your book brings this one up. Most of the textbooks leave this one out, but when I hear people talk about learning, more than any other topic, they seem to go to anecdotal information. So anecdotal means that you just look at your own life and go, what was that like for me? Or you ask a couple friends, and they don't even have to be friends. You can just pick one person at random on a bus. They don't even have to be on a bus. And just say, what was this like for you? That's anecdotal information. And personally, I think anecdotal information is fascinating. Human behavior is so complex and unendingly fascinating and interesting. It's one of the reasons I love studying psychology, trying to understand people and their behavior. And so, it's hard to be on a plane or a bus or anywhere, grocery store, and not start talking to someone to try to understand, what's causing the behavior that they're doing or what's their experience of various life events. But that information has lots of drawbacks. It is the least reliable method that we have. And it's great for you to maybe connect and understand that person, but it's not going to help you understand all people everywhere. And in psychology, we want to be able to generalize things to most people, or at least for a certain group of people, or people of a certain age, or people with a certain background. Anecdotal information does not allow us to know whether or not that situation was unique to that person or a common thing that happens to most people. Also, people aren't always good at, in anecdotal information, really letting you know exactly what's going on. So sometimes the information itself isn't all that accurate. And with anecdotal information, we cannot imply causation at all. So it's our least valuable method, but it's a nice place to start. I have yet to think of a research question that I'm trying to explore and not get a couple anecdotes, not ask a couple people at a cocktail party or something, or at a church group. What was this experience like for you? Just to get a sense of what people think. Anecdotal information. Yeah, here's an example of how I think from this example, you'll really see how anecdotal information has a lot of drawbacks. If I ask you, how did you feel during your first day of middle school? So think back. For you, it might not be that long ago. For me, it's a long time ago. First day of middle school. Now, let's say I'm doing a study looking at socio-emotional maturity in rising sixth graders. In other words, kids that are about to enter middle school. If I talk to you about, by asking you that situation, by using anecdotes, I'm probably going to gain some information about what it was like for you. But is that going to be true among a whole bunch of different people? I mean, I went to middle school in the I guess I was 1970s, or it might have even been late 1960s in the Boston area. You might have been in Oklahoma and it was just, less than 10 years ago. And so very different experiences, but they may have some commonalities. What anecdotal information is useful, but it's not valid, it's not easily generalizable, and you cannot imply causation. So oftentimes we use case studies. Case studies are like it's like anecdotal information on steroids. So with a case study, we're going to take one or sometimes a few people, and we are going to dig deep and learn everything that there is to know about that person or those few people. So I might choose 3 Cameron students and then say, will you participate in the study? And they say yes. And I'm going to interview their parents and ask their parents, do you remember what their first day of middle school was like? Can you tell me what happened to them? I'm going to go back and interview their teachers who taught their first classes in middle school. I might ask them who their friends in middle school were, and go back and interview their friends. What did you think her first day was like? And you can see how we're going to get all the information we can about the first couple of days of middle school for these 3 people. And we're going to get that data from as many sources as we can. So in a case study, we're going to examine one or a few individuals in great detail. It's used a lot to help us understand abnormal behavior. So the picture of the man I have here is HM, and HM was in a terrible accident. And after the accident, his memory was forever changed. He had some personality changes. And so they went in and really studied what happened in his brain, what were the actual changes to the structure of the brain and the blood in the brain and all the neural connections, and tried to see which of those impacted his learning, or it gave them some ideas of maybe which areas of the brain are responsible for which types of learning. The problem with the case study method is that it takes a lot of time. It's very intensive. Even if what we're finding oftentimes cannot generalize to groups of people, because you're just doing it with one or a couple people. I'm sure none of you would be comfortable with me after talking and learning all about 3 people who didn't like changing classes one after the other. For me to say changing classes is too stressful. No, like that was their experience. We really want to be able to collect data from more people to be able to generalize to a wider group of people. We cannot imply causation at all from case study. And oftentimes with the case study, if it's an ongoing question, just by asking the question, we can end up changing the behavior that we're trying to look at. In addition, case studies rely on self-report, which has its drawbacks. People aren't always honest. Let's get to the next one, descriptive studies. These descriptive studies include like the survey method and interviews, things like that. So with the interviews and surveys, everyone in here, or everyone who's watching me, has done a survey at some point or been interviewed at some point. So it's great because we can usually survey a large number of people very quickly. If you do it nowadays using mTurk, you can get it on the computer, so you can get the people from, you know, all over the United States. Now, granted, it's only people who have access to the computer and want to do this type of thing, but it makes it much easier to generalize, although you can only generalize to the group that ended up being in your study. It's definitely more reliable than anecdotal information. However, we still cannot imply causation, and you still have the problem of self-report. So one piece of the self-report problem is that people don't always tell the truth. Another problem with self-report is the way that you ask the questions on a survey or in an interview can actually influence the responses that you get. So I know we used to have, as part of our experimental psychology class here, people would have to do some kind of a project. This was before we had psychological research. And as part of the project, because you had to get started earlier in the semester, no one really had the time or the knowledge to run an experiment. So quite often people would use the survey method. And many of the students that I had when we taught experimental back then were interested in adultery. They were interested in, you know, cheating behavior. And so on the surveys, people would ask, have you ever committed adultery? Yes or no? And what we found is that a lot of people will say no, and you get very low rates of adultery. And some of the students were like, we don't think that this is true. We think people are lying, which could be. So later, later other semesters, when people would go to ask the question, I'd say, why don't you throw in a couple different questions that are looking at that? And so one question would be, have you ever committed adultery? Yes or no? Then later in the survey, they'd be asked, have you ever had sexual intercourse with someone that you are not married to during the time that you were married? Yes or no? If you answered yes, how many times? If you answered yes, with how many partners? And it became hilarious how many people would complete the survey and say, no, I never committed adultery. But later on, yes, I had sexual intercourse with people that were not my partner during the time when I was married. Yes, I did. Number of partners, you know, 3, number of times, you know, 100. And you're just going, wow. So how you ask the question using the term adultery, you know, that's one of the big 10. And so people oftentimes are not going to say, you know, are not going to respond. They'll respond to words like adultery, feminism, liberal, conservative, religious, spiritual, these very socially sensitive terms people will respond differently to. And so you've got problems with self-report using the survey method. Our gold standard, what we love, is the experiment. And we love the experiment because only with the experimental method, and only if it's done well, can we imply causation. Can we say that one variable caused the other? And we love to be able to imply causation. We love to understand what is causing behaviors. Why do we love to know that? Because then we can change it. So what is causing me to be overweight? If I can determine that, then I can perhaps change those causes, those things that are causing, I can change those, and then my weight would go down. And oftentimes there's more than one cause. In human behavior, they tend to be incredibly complex. So when it comes for you to do your behavioral modification project, you're going to try to decrease one of your behaviors or increase it. In order to decrease, let's say, staying up late at night, you're going to have to determine what is causing you to stay up at night. And so for your thing, you're using introspection and all kinds of things. But if a researcher wanted to know what causes people to stay up at night, an experimental method is going to be one of the only ways that we can really look at causation. Now, how do we look at causation? Well, in an experiment, the experimenter is going to manipulate some variables. We're going to call those variables independent variables. And then we're going to see the effect of that manipulation on the dependent variable. And in psychology of learning, you already know what these dependent variables are most of the time. It's going to be like errors, latency, rate, speed, the ones that we talked about in the first video. So what do we mean by an independent variable? This is the variable that the experimenter manipulates. So if we're interested in that first question that you thought about in the last video, do students learn psychology of learning material better through watching videos, reading the textbook, or both? We could randomly assign one group of psychology majors to just read the textbook, randomly assign a different group of students to just watch the videos, and randomly assign a third group of students to do both. Then we would show them the videos or give them access to the book or both, depending on the condition that they're in. Try to keep everything else exactly the same, and then give them all a test. And so we might give them a multiple choice question test and then look at the number of errors that they make. And we would then be able to determine whether or not reading the text, watching the video, or both led to better performance. So the key thing here, though, is that the independent variable needs to be manipulated. If it can't be manipulated, if we can't randomly assign people to one of the conditions, then it's not an experiment. Many times when I go to teach psychological research, where students now actually have to perform an experiment, students are interested in things like the effects of having an alcoholic parent. How are children, adult children of alcoholics different from children who are not, people who are raised by parents who are not alcoholics? Well, I cannot randomly assign people to be raised by an alcoholic, and I can't randomly assign people to be raised by someone who doesn't struggle with addiction. So I can't look at that using the experimental method. Now I can look at it in other ways, but I cannot use the experimental method, and I can never imply causation. I will never be able to say this person behaves this way because they were raised by someone who is an alcoholic. Okay, so independent variable, we're going to manipulate something, and then we're going to see the effect of it on something else. Sometimes when you're reading an experiment, it can be difficult to determine what is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable. Here's a trick that I have. If you can put it into a sentence that says blank causes blank. So you might say candy causes kids to become hyperactive. You might say, I think there's an example here. Watching aggressive TV causes someone to act more aggressively on the playground. Reading psychology of learning material causes a person to learn the material better than if they saw it on a video. You can see that that first thing that we're talking about is going to be your independent variable. And the second thing, blank causes blank. The first thing is your independent variable. The second thing is your dependent variable. Okay? If we're looking to see, does candy cause kids to be hyperactive? We could randomly assign one group of kids to get no candy, one group of kids to have a small package of M&Ms, have one group of kids eat a huge big Sam's bag of M&Ms. And then after they've eaten their candy, then we all have them do the exact same behavior, like maybe they all get the same coloring sheet with the same crayons that they're going to color. And then we measure their activity level. Okay, and so the independent variable is going to be how much candy they get. The dependent variable is how active they are afterwards. We've got two major or main experimental designs that we use. We differentiate them, we call them between subject designs and within subject designs. So in a between subjects design, we're going to randomly assign people to all of the different levels of the independent variable. Every example that I've used so far in this lecture has been a between subjects design example. So when we randomly assign kids to different level of candy, when we randomly assign one group of kids to watch aggressive television programs and another group of kids to watch TV shows that aren't very aggressive, and then look to see how aggressive they are on the playground. That's a between subjects design. If we have one group of subjects read the textbook material, one group watch a video over the material, and have another group do both, that's a between subjects design. So in a between subjects design, you're going to have two or more groups of participants, and then you vary the independent variable greatly among these groups. So you expose one group to aggression and another one doesn't get aggression, and then you see how they differ. So the differences in behavior among the groups is assumed to be due to the independent variable, okay? A within subject design is what we need to use a lot of the time with learning, when we're studying learning. And the reason is because with a between subjects design, it only works well if the groups that you're comparing started out being pretty much the same. That you can do that through random assignment. Like what we would want to know is that the 3 groups of kids that we were giving candy, that before the study began, we had the same mix of kids that were hyperactive and super calm and in the middle in each of the 3 groups. Or the hyperactivity level at the end wouldn't be due to the candy. It would be due to the fact that one of the groups was more hyper than one of the other groups before the candy was even given to them, right? So we want to try, one of the things that allows us to imply causation is to make sure that the groups before they're given the independent variable have roughly the same mix of people. The problem is that when you go to study learning a lot of the time, especially with humans, it's really hard to get roughly the same mix of people. So if I am a visual learner and I've spent most of my life learning really well through pictures, then I'm going to respond to an experimental situation differently than if I were, if I had a different learning style, if I was more of a kinesthetic learner who learned better by touching things and feeling things. And so there are so many individual differences, IQ, learning history, how much the person knew before they were even exposed to any of the information. It's very hard with human beings to keep that all constant so that before you're introduced to the independent variable, the groups are all the same. So oftentimes we rely on within subject designs instead. With a within subject design, you measure the person's behavior before they get the independent variable and then after they get the independent variable. So when we're talking about candy, we would take kids and we would give the kids no candy at all and then measure how hyper they are. Then on another day at another time, we might give them a whole bunch of candy, the huge Sam's bag of candy, and see how they are then, see how hyper they are after that, and then bring them back a couple of days later and give them the regular bag of M&Ms and see how they do there, how hyper they get after that. Now, we're going to have to change, we're going to have to randomly assign the order in which they get these different things. So some kids will get no candy, then the small bag, then the huge bag. Some will get no candy, then the huge bag, then the small bag. Some will get the huge bag, then the small bag, then the no candy, and so on and so on. So we'll randomly assign them to the orders that they're going to get the independent variable. But at the end of the study, we'll know that these were all the same kids. If they're different in activity level, it can't be due to their nature or how internally active they are most of the time. It must be due to the candy or something about the situation. If you kept the situation the same, you'd be in good shape. So when we measure so we're going to measure someone, then give them the level of the independent variable, and then measure them again. That's a within subjects design. And the differences in the dependent variable are presumed to be the result of the different experiences, in other words, the independent variable. Okay, the last section of the book talks about research methods with animals, and we do not have an animal lab at Cameron University, and I don't think well, I know that there's not even any talk of us ever getting an animal lab. In psychology of learning, a lot of the studies do involve animals, so I think reading that part of the book is very important, but I'm not going to lecture on it at all in a video. After you finish reading this chapter, I highly recommend that you do the practice quiz on page 54 and 55, and you will have covered all of chapter 2, and that's the goal for week 2. So I will see you guys all next week.